Welcome back to the Williams Real Estate Channel. I'm your host, Geordie Williams, and tonight we are running through the February 2025 property market update. So stay tuned, a couple of slides of across Australia, and I'll give you a feel for where each market sits currently based off the 18-year land cycle. But before we get into that and give you a forecast, we'll start with what has happened to date. So as of Feb 2025, this is CoreLogic data for the dwelling price month on month for Australia. We had 0.3% increase for the month. So the short-lived decline has been regained already. And I don't suspect that we are due for a significant downturn until another, I'd say, 2 years away. So we are, and that's only in certain markets too. So had pretty much regained pretty well flat market really, if you look at the market as a whole. And if we dig deeper, we can see that there has been a pretty strong response, I think, from this rate cut that we've just had. I can even feel it on the ground. Sentiment has definitely shifted. People are more eager to get in now. A lot of people, I think, have been sitting on the sidelines waiting for, I guess, confirmation from the RBA that we have more or less reached the limit in terms of rate hiking session. This could be it. Who knows? We'll see what inflation does over the next coming months. But as you can see, there's been a strong month for Feb. 0.3% in Sydney, 0.4% increase in Melbourne, 0.2 in Brisbane, 0.3 in Adelaide, 0.3 in Perth, 0.4 in Hobart, and negative 0.1 in Darwin. So collectively, the combined capitals 0.3% up for the month, so a strong month, and the combined regions 0.4%. Now, if we dig a little deeper and see, I like to look at an annualized basis as well. We can see the leading market for the last 12 months has been Perth with 14.3% increase, followed by Adelaide at 11.9% increase for the last 12 months, then Brisbane at 9.7%, followed by, I guess, Darwin and Sydney, more or less flat markets. Melbourne softening, negative 3%. But it's not necessarily these hot overheated markets you want to get into at this stage of the cycle, which I'll get to in the future slides. More so Sydney and Melbourne is where we are currently focusing on. Combined regions 2.5% increase for the year to date, last 12 months. And if we look even deeper, we can see that over the past 12 months, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide have been the outperformers along with their respective regions. And if we look at Sydney, Melbourne, Melbourne's been negative by 3.2% and Sydney's been up 1%. So more or less flat markets in Sydney and Melbourne, along with the respective regions being New South Wales region and Victoria have more or less been pretty well flat as well. Victoria negative 2.2 and New South Wales up 2.5%, but more or less pretty well flat markets for the regions in New South Wales and Victoria. And as you can see, WA, South Australia and Queensland have had a solid last 12 months in the regions as they're typically outperform in the later stage of the 18-year land cycle. That brings me to our framework that we like to use is the 18-year land cycle, which consists of 14 years of expansion, 4 years of downturn, and the 14 years of expansion is interrupted with a mid-cycle slowdown. In the first half of the cycle, if you look at historical sales data, Sydney and Melbourne typically outperform. People then get priced out of Sydney and Melbourne. They decentralize into the regions in New South Wales and Victoria. That's when New South Wales, Victoria tend to outperform in the midpoint of the cycle. People then halfway through the cycle get fed up with the prices in New South Wales and Victoria. They then decentralise into the more affordable markets such as Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and their respective regions. And that's when we now are seeing those markets performing, as we are now on the blue marker in the later stage of the 18-year land cycle, and we are about 16 to 18 months away from peak market before we'll then enter the next land-driven downturn. So people have been hitting me up recently saying, well, why are you buying if we're due for a downturn? When the market turns, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and some of the regions will get hit the hardest, as the ripple effect will come back to Sydney and Melbourne, and Sydney and Melbourne will then lead again. So there's always a market to buy in, as not every market or even type of property or even asset class for that matter perform concurrently to the rhythm of the 18-year land cycle. The 18-year land cycle is a framework we use to understand where we sit in the market firstly. So we sit now on the blue marker, which equivalent point of time mid-late 2005, year and a half to 2 years away from peak market in 2007 before we then went through the GFC. That's where we sit. So if you know where we sit in the market, then you can overlay the framework on every type of asset class, whether it's property, stocks, commodities, gold, silver, crypto, everything. You can overlay it on interest rate cycles and see where we actually sit, what happened based off history. Because if you study history, the further and further back you go will give you the best, clearest picture of where we are heading in the years ahead. So this is why we use it as a framework. It's not to say that every market's going to tank in the next 2 or 3 years. The regions in Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide will get hit the hardest. Townsville, for example, in 2005, 6, 7, had a solid run up to 2007. And then when the GFC hit, Townsville switched off and went through a 15 years of retracement back to the same price point than in 2005. This is the framework, understanding where we sit in the market, using it as a framework, and then you can overlay it on certain markets to see where they currently sit. What happened based off history will give you a good indication of where they're heading in the years ahead, because a lot of people are ploughing into the likes of Townsville and Cairns and up the coastline of Queensland. As always, they always do. The mainstream punters like to charge into overheated markets towards their tail end. But unfortunately, they're obviously not across this sort of information, this data. It's taken me a good 15 years to get to my level of understanding of the cycle and how I can capitalize not only of the upside, but protect yourself of the downside and be prepared for when the market does turn, that you've got the money and the cash ready to go to buy the bargains, as there will be blood on the streets. So that's the framework. Keep in mind now, we are in equivalent point of the time in 2005, as you look at these future slides. So I was a bit late to the punch running these reports, and they've clicked over into March, but they update every time you run them. So they're saying March, but this is basically to date. This is Perth units. I've cut it for units and houses for every market. So we're comparing apples for apples. But as you can see, and as you're aware, Perth is away at the races, sucking a lot of punters in, as it always does. But typically markets don't go more than 150% growth in one growth cycle. Peak to, trough to peak, 180% growth, and then it'll top out and then soften probably 10 or 15% and then go through a protracted flat period. So once a market has gone through 100% growth, it's definitely not a market I like to enter into, because it's odds on favorite, it's hitting its limits and is about to top out and then go through another solid 10 plus years of next to no growth. However, lots of people tend to get the fear of missing out when it becomes mainstream. It's blasted all over the news that a market's pumping. Hence why a lot of people are charging into Perth still, but the risk is definitely more so for the downside in Perth. As you can see, it is away at the races. And look what happened back in 2005. As I said before, we are in a similar point of the cycle in 2005. Same goes. It was charging all the way up to 2006-7. And then once we went through the GFC, it switched off and went through this up and down protracted period of next to no growth and went even further down in 2019 and 2020 than the price point where it reached when it hit its limits. So odds on favorite, if you continue to keep buying in Perth, units in Perth, within the next 10 years, you could find yourself in negative equity. Houses, a little bit more stable in Perth, but same story. They've had a solid run up from, I mean, this is a specific suburb in Perth, you know, around the 550, 600 grand price point. Now it's hitting close to $1 million. So it's nearly 100% growth. So it will have, I mean, houses in Perth will have another year or two of growth. Once it hits its limits in another year or two, it'll pretty much flatten out. Won't go as south as units. Houses can be a little bit more stable over the long term. So not as bad, but I would put my money in a different market, knowing that Perth houses are probably 20, 30% from the peak. And once they hit their peak, they'll flatline for a good 10 plus years. Brisbane units, away at the races. I mean, I can even give the suburb. This is Woodridge in that Logan area. We're buying up a lot around Logan for 150 grand, 160 grand, 200 grand back in 2018, 2019, because it was after a protracted long period of flat growth. When at that point, I get super eager and excited because there's basically any time when she can switch and go through a bull run, like what happened from 2021 and onwards. But it's now starting to hit its limits because, as you can see, it's gone from that 200 grand price point to 400 grand. It's doubled, 100% growth. It'll have a bit more juice left in the tank, probably another, I'd say 30 to 40% growth, but then it'll top out, soften by 10 or 15%, and then start another protracted long period of time of next to no growth. Even if we've got the Brisbane Olympic Games coming up, the Olympic Games and infrastructure is great, but that is like, they'll give the Brisbane market a sugar hit, the final sugar hit, but it's not a reason now to invest. You need to bake the cake in right from the start and let the market do the heavy lifting. So you bake the cake in from the start, let the market do the heavy lifting like what has happened in the last few years, and not keep plowing into a market once it's already gone up 100%. Because of the Olympic Games and all the infrastructure and all the bullshit. That's great. I'm all for infrastructure spend, but it's not a reason to invest. That is the cherry icing on the cake. You need to get into markets before they've had growth runs if you want to build a long-term, sustainable, large property portfolio. Otherwise, you'd be like 99% of people who end up buying peak market, holding it for many years, getting a bit of a sugar hit during the Olympic Games, and then once the Olympic Games is gone, it'll switch off, and then you'll be holding an asset pretty well at the same price point, if not in negative equity, for many years until another 10 or 15 years away until we experience the next growth cycle up in Brisbane. So when you buy property, you are buying its future growth, not what has been. So I can't stress this enough. Do not get sucked into the mainstream herd and be like 90% of people out there that see it on the news, here it's good market, and then plow in right at the tail end where all the growth is pretty much gone. Houses, again, similar story, but are probably closer to hitting their limits. As you can see, it's starting to trim off a bit. We were buying houses in Brizzy for about 250 grand back in 19, 20, 21. I mean, now everything's 600-700 plus, and it won't keep going. That's the other thing. People say, I hear all the time, oh, well, Brisbane's cheap compared to Sydney. It is not Sydney. Each market needs to be looked at on its own merits. If you compare it to a different market, that's a fool's game because Sydney is a global city. It's the most diversified economy along with Melbourne. It competes with the same talent out of New York, Hong Kong, Beijing, LA, all these major markets. That's where it's at. it's not on the same level as Brisbane. So you can't compare one market to another. Every market needs to be looked at in its own light, on its own merits, and where it has been historically and where it could go in the future years ahead. Because markets do not just keep going on 200, 300, 400, 500% growth in its single growth cycle. It goes up, from the trough peak max 180 I've seen. It then softens to about that 150, 120% growth, and then it'll flatline for many years. On average 10, sometimes 7, sometimes 12, 13, but on average 10, depending on what market and how diversified the economy is in that market, in terms of what the industries are supporting that market, until the local wage can rise enough to allow people to be able to afford more debt to then put into the market and grow the credit base and lend more from the banks to put into the property market to expand to that next price point. It just doesn't keep running. So Brisbane will never catch up to Sydney because it's a completely different market. It's not landlocked like Sydney is. It's not the doorstep to Australia down in Sydney. Brisbane has got an abundance of land that they can develop and release, and it doesn't have the key industries and the infrastructure like what Sydney does. Regional Queensland is even closer to its peak. As you can see, had a solid run the last couple of years, and back in 2005 had a little bit more growth, but more or less is probably 20, 30% from its peak, and then we'll top out over the next couple of years and go through this protracted flat to negative period. So as another market, I mean, I'm all for regional Queensland. We've bought many properties across regional Queensland. I mean, personally, I've got about 5 or 6 houses in the regions in Queensland that I'm looking to subdivide to build second dwellings on now, because now is a good time to develop when everything stacks up. It's feasible. You can create another property by subdividing it to either build a modest granny flat or a second dwelling. Rather than going and buying another house for 450, 500, we're buying them for 200 grand, 120 grand, 200 grand, 220,000. Now we can subdivide them and build second houses for that same price point, or 250, 300 grand, get it prefab installed, create a second property at wholesale rate, and then once it's on the market, it'll be worth 450, 500 plus. So that's a good strategy we like to look at once the market has started its run. I've got 3 DAs in, and I'm tangling it over councils with setbacks, restrictions, flood levels, all the bullshit, the usual. Property development is a long game. So I've got a long-term horizon. At some point, the density will increase. They'll improve the drainage of the towns so the water doesn't pool in the streets, and allow for development, because, I mean, some of these towns it's crazy. There's 2 or 3 rentals at any one time. So they need the stock, and at some point they won't have a choice but to allow development, because otherwise people will be just living on the streets. Adelaide units has topped out, and as you can see, it's now started to its retracement, and we'll probably, based off history, I mean, history doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. So I believe now units have, since last month, you can see that we're now starting to, looks like it's hit its limit, and it will soften out 10, 15%, and then go through a period of pretty well flat line, like what happened from 2005, 6 all the way through to 2020. So another market where we are no longer looking at, as you can see, it has gone up 100% in the last couple of years, and will not continue to keep going. It'll flatten out for good while before incomes rise, allow people to borrow more money, and then it will hook through another growth cycle in probably 15 years' time, 10 to 15 years' time. Adelaide houses, similar story, but more stable. Houses are a little bit more stable than units. Units tend to boom bust, so that's why it's good to get into units right at their tail end of a protracted period, because you can make more than double your money, 150, 180% growth if you can time it right. Houses are a little bit more stable, but Adelaide houses are starting to hit its limit. As you can see, it's starting to curl over a bit, and based off history, it will have probably a little bit more growth, but then more or less will flatten out over the next few years. Sydney units, we're getting excited on Sydney units in certain markets, certain products, certain suburbs. It is coming to a point where it has been up and down since 2016, 2017, but it's based off history, 2005-6 due to soften. The deals will be popping, but as of 2007, it commenced its growth cycle for a solid 10 years. So that is pretty much what will probably happen from around 2027 and onwards, units in Sydney. So great time to start looking around. If you're keen to buy a unit in Sydney, hit us up. We've got many deals, many off-market deals. We're buying, units between 313,000 to 340,000. As you can see here, this suburb, which we've bought in a few times for 340, 313, 330. The median is nearly 500, 450, 500. So you may be thinking, how do I do it? Well, you need to build up relationships with agents. It takes many years to be buying frequently through agents. Because when I buy a deal, I then ask agents to go door knock for me. And they'll only do it if they know that you've got buyers and backup buyers ready to go. And when they door knock, if they can get a buyer on the fence, potentially might sell, you can present them a contract and they don't have to present it or tart it up or run it to auction or pay for marketing fees. So they get a quick deal, and that way you can get a great deal. So it's a win-win-win. They get a quick deal. They don't have to do much work, sign a contract, bang, done, settle in 30 days, ideally cash buy, and that's where you get the real good deals. So the deals are still out there for sure, and we're buying them now, even though it's due to soften. I can't wait for it to soften because then you get even better deals. But we're buying between that 350 mark to 400, and even some of the ones that need a bit of work closer to the 300 mark. So there's deals in the 300 grand mark in Sydney. You just need to know where to look and have the relationships to be able to get the properties off market. So that's Sydney. Houses. Houses have probably a little bit more, had a good solid run the last few years, but as you can see in the first half of the current cycle, from around 2013 up to like 2017, that's the solid growth run, but then again kicked. So I think houses in Sydney, based off history from 2005 to 2011-12, are due to soften out and plateau. And I think units are going to be the outperformers in the coming years. Regional New South Wales houses have had a solid run from 2015 all the way up to 2021-22, where they topped out and have now come back 10 to 15% and have started their protracted, probably 10 years of flatline growth, like what happened from 2005, where we sit equivalent point of time, all the way through till 2015 until it commenced its growth cycle. So that is plenty of time on the regional New South Wales regions. And if you've got property out there, you're probably wondering why it's starting to soften. Well, this is the cycle. So I'm personally getting to position to offload a couple of houses in New South Wales regions to pay down debt, raise cash, free up my personal balance sheet, but then also deploy cash into my my trust, so then I can buy bigger assets such as blocks of units in markets that are set for the next growth cycle, so I can keep growing and expanding and scaling further. So I'm a bit of an active investor. I like to buy in markets, hold them through growth cycles, and then sell them once you've got all the growth. You've got all the gains that you can by renovation development. Once you can't add any more value into a site and it's had its growth run, I'd rather sell assets rather than holding them through a 10 years period where they're at the same price point, because I could sell it. Yes, you got to pay the capital gain, but you pay down your debt, you free up borrowing power, you raise cash, then you can put that cash as a deposit into a larger asset. So if you can sell a unit, or if you can sell a house and then buy a block of units, that makes sense. Bigger asset in a market that's set for its next growth run, then you can keep growing and scaling and moving and shaking. So that's my plan. Regional New South Wales is definitely not a market we're looking to buy in, but time will come back. There's always a market to buy in, but right now, regional New South Wales is not the top one on our list. Units in Melbourne, we've been getting a few deals in Melbourne recently. As you can see, based off 2005-6, got probably another year or so before it will then commence its growth cycle, which I'm already feeling on the ground. Melbourne units and certain products, you can't go blind and buy any unit in Melbourne. You'll lose your shirt. It's not every unit, not every type. So development in Melbourne is a lot more relaxed than compared to Sydney. Like the City of Sydney Council, very hard council, very difficult, very anti-development. So that restricts supply. You drive around in Melbourne, there's high-rise apartment buildings getting thrown up everywhere. Plus, Melbourne's not landlocked like Sydney. Sydney has the mountain ranges. There's only so far that Sydney can expand out, whereas Melbourne, the land's flat for donkey's years. It just keeps going and going. So the supply equation down in Melbourne is not as restricted compared to Sydney. So that's why you have to be careful of not overpaying, definitely not overpay, but types of properties in certain locations will only perform in the future years ahead. I'm putting content out there saying, we're buying in Melbourne, but it's not everything we'll buy in Melbourne. It's probably only 10% of the stock on the market or off market, which would be actually interested in buying. It's not, you can't just go and assume that you'll do well if you just go and buy something in Melbourne. You probably won't. It's only certain types of products and only certain price points. And recently we just settled on a deal, just secured a deal for 265,000 two-bedroom unit right in Melbourne. That's got a CoreLogic valuation of 330,000 and up to 360, and the medium price point, what's this one right here, is 400 to 450. So we're buying deals for sub 300. How do you do it? Relationships with agents. You need to be buying for many years, build relationships, and then get off-market deals, get cracking off-market deals, because then you can build your equity in from day one, and then within 6 to 12 months, you can then, what I like to do is buy them slightly tired, vacate tenant, paint walls, rip up carpet, spruce it up a little bit, 5-10 grand worth of work. Don't overcapitalize because you can save that money for another deposit. But overdue maintenance, regrout, tiled wet areas, re-silicon everything, paint bathrooms, maybe rip out a vanity, replace it, freshen it up, get it back on the market for an extra 100, 150 bucks a week, get your 7, 8, 9% yield, then go back to the bank with a 12-month lease, providing an 8% yield, CoreLogic valuation of 30 to 50, 100 grand more, grab a comparable sale of the same product that's sold in the same area to say, hey, bank, it's like a business case. Here's the lease providing an 8% yield. Here's the CoreLogic valuation saying it's worth 400 when I bought it for 300. And here's a comparable sale that just sold in the same block or around the corner for 450. I believe it's now worth 450. I want to refinance my loan up to 80% of the new value. You'll haggle a bit. Some banks won't do it. Then you got to shop around. Shop around to different banks to find the bank that will give you the most money. And I'd rather pay more interest provided I can get more money. So it's a cost of doing business interest. So I don't really care about the interest so much. It's more so who'll give me the biggest loan and the best valuation so you can draw the equity, get your capital back out and keep moving forward into the next deal. So that's a bit on Melbourne, bit of a sidetrack, but that's how we operate. Currently, houses in Melbourne too are showing value, good value. they're due to flatline for a little while based off history, based on 2005, 6, 7. But as of 2027, they'll then start their next growth run. Regional Victoria. So we like buying houses and blocks of units in the regions. But I just threw up houses just to give you a feel for what's going on in regional Victoria. It is in a downturn. So no rush on regional Victoria. I know some people are getting all excited about regional Vic, but it topped out in 22 and it started retracement, pretty aggressive retracement, to be honest. Like it's already lost probably over 10, 15% from peak. And based off history, it will stabilize and then flatline for a little while, but won't be for a few years until it'll commence another significant growth run, like what has happened in the last few years. So this is a snapshot summary of where I feel each market is based off the 18-year land cycle and using this historical sales data. I mean, let's start with the hot markets. Adelaide pretty much hitting its limits, probably 2 or 3 months away from hitting its peak. It'll then start to soften. Regional Queensland, probably 2 years away from hitting its peak, and then it'll cool. Brisbane, two or 3 years till it'll top out. Perth, probably 3 to 4 years, 3 and a bit years till top out and then soften. So Brisbane and Perth, regional Queensland. I don't have regional WA. It's getting too out back ass and nowhere for my liking. So, but these markets here tend to continue to outperform even when we go through the land-driven downturn because they've got a dependency on the mining sector. So especially regional Queensland. So potentially these markets, so regional Queensland, Brisbane and Perth, tend to buck the trend for a couple of years, 2 or 3, maybe 2 years extra. So till the later in the decade, 28, 29. But come 2030, 2031, they'll then switch off and go through a solid retracement for a good 10 years, like what happened in Perth between 2012, 2013, all the way down to 2020, 2021. We have regional New South Wales, regional Victoria have already topped out in 2020 and have started to cool and will continue to cool for a good few years before they will bottom out and then start their growth run. Melbourne and Sydney. Melbourne's pretty much flatline and will continue to flatline for a little while, probably a year or so. Already starting to see little green shoots. I mean, it's starting to get a little bit more competitive than last year. So green shoots are starting, but it's pretty well flatlining, I reckon, for the next year or so. Sydney is softening and will continue to soften this year and next. But come, say, 27, 28, Sydney and Melbourne will be bottomed out. And then come later the decade, they'll then start prices rising. In 5 years' time, the FOMO 5, 6 years' time, FOMO, stupid money will all be pouring in, and the markets will be going gangbusters, and the markets will continue to keep turning and carrying on. So, hope you enjoyed that. As always, this content is definitely general in nature. It is by no means financial or general advice. Before taking any action or buying any property, make sure you seek out legal, independent financial advice, tax advice, whatever you got to do, go talk to whoever you got to do before doing anything. If you want help from a buyer's agent perspective, shoot me an email, send me some feedback, send this to anyone you think would see of value of it. What I can say is do not get carried away with the herd. Do not get fear of missing out. There's always plenty of time to buy property, and those that are actually patient and more strategic and get into markets that are more suppressed will actually do better than getting flustered and carried away with the mainstream herd and rush into overheated markets and buy premium peak market, and then you'll learn the hard way if you do that. And definitely stay away from new and off the plan stuff. Even if there's spruikers, there's lots of spruikers out there these days pushing these hot overheated markets. Even some buyers agents are pushing markets that are definitely not the right markets to be getting into. It is like when we had a large explosion of mortgage brokers from 2000 to 2007, or if you go back to the 90s where we had the insurance brokers big boom, buyers agent brokers, there's a big boom right now. And when the market turns, the people who aren't across the 18-year land cycle, who don't actually have skin in the game, who have come out of different corporations or different industries and have just trying a new job, will end up learning the hard way. And the market is definitely not forgiving. So buyers beware, be very cautious. It is a pivotal point of time now in the markets. You don't necessarily want to be getting into overheated markets. I can't stress that enough. I'm going to be personally even offloading properties the next couple of years out of Brisbane to cash up, pay down debt, get ready to then start buying out like crazy, because the best buying opportunity is on the horizon. But as always, this is by no means financial advice, but if you want help running reports of your own properties that you've got and you're unsure of what you want to do and you don't know where they sit in the market, hit me up. We can do a strategy session. We do a 2-hour session where we unpack your position, your holdings, where they sit in the market, what your capacity is, what your risk profile is, what your skill set is, if you're a corporate person or if you're from a trade background that wants to get into fixing up, doing the renovations and development. We can explore all that. We can map out a plan. 10 properties in 10 years, easy. Very conservative approach using my blueprint of units in the metros, regional houses, and then duplexes in both metro and region, and then blocks of units. You scale up, start small, slowly scale up. If the bank's going to lend you $1 million, $2 million, that doesn't necessarily mean you should put that all into one site. You need to diversify your capital, got there in the end, across multiple markets, multiple asset classes, and allow the markets to do the heavy lifting. Until next time, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like, subscribe, dislike, comment, whatever you got to do. I'll see you on the next one.